Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you all how to make my favorite vegan croissants, so stay tuned for the rest of the video to check out the full vegan recipe tutorial. For today's recipe, we're going to start actually by making the butter insert. So this is day one, we're making the butter insert to our vegan croissants, and this method has been adapted by Baker Caroline Weller's method of making croissants. She makes hers with animal products, and I've adapted most of her recipe to a vegan recipe, but this butter method is definitely one that I read from her book, which is quite excellent, so I want to share it with you all. So by prepping 2 sticks of vegan butter, I'm using the Plant Crock plant-based butter. It's one of my favorite. And you're going to take 2 sticks, cut each stick in half, and then cut each half into small rectangles, getting about 3 rectangles from each side, so a total of 6 thinner rectangles from your sticks of butter. And this is super important because we're going to be making and laying these flat on some parchment paper that's been cut and measured to about 16 inches in length. It doesn't have to be super perfect, but I go by 16 inches. So it creates the parchment papers in a rectangle shape, and we will then add the butter to the inside of this parchment paper to create a sort of butter rectangle that we will later insert into our prepared dough, and it'll make layering way easier. So the reason that this method is used in Caroline Weller's recipe is because of simplicity, but I find that this is super helpful for vegan croissants because vegan butter is made from a lot of different butters, so it has a different consistency depending on which brand you choose. So I suggest using this specific brand that I've demonstrated and I'm using in this video. No sponsorship, just really enjoy their stuff. So you're gonna add the butter squares to the inside of your parchment paper, and it's going to be a 3 by 4, so 3 rectangles in terms of your vertical, and then 4 rectangles in terms of your horizontal, and then you're going to close it with some parchment paper and take that rolling pin and lay it as flat as you can, making sure that the butter at least is all attached. If for some reason your rectangle isn't perfect in terms of dimensions and you think it's a little bit odd, don't hesitate too much because the point is just to get a rectangular slab of butter. So once you've done that, throw your butter slab, your butter insert, into the freezer or the refrigerator depending on how cold you want your butter to be. I always put it in the freezer just to be safe, and then I let it hang out at room temperature about 5 minutes before I insert it. To make the dough, we're going to start by adding 300 grams of soy milk, then some sourdough starter. Feel free to omit this, but I added 85 grams of sourdough starter. I always have this around, so I always add it to some sort of bake because sourdough is great for you, and it's also just an easy way to use it. And then add about 45 grams of vegan melted butter. These are croissants, damas y caballeros, so it's gonna have a lot of butter in it. That is what makes it so delicious. Mix all of those wet ingredients up until well combined, and afterwards we're gonna add our dry ingredients to our mixer. You can also, of course, do this by hand. Add about 500 grams of bread flour or all-purpose flour if you do not have bread flour. And then about a tablespoon or 9 grams of instant yeast. And last but not least, 12 to 15 grams of salt. So add all of those dry ingredients and mix until completely well included. Let that mixer run for a little bit and allow your dough to form. Don't overmix it. It should stick to your dough hook, but it shouldn't be super dry either. You don't want to over knead it. I took that bad boy out, kneaded it a little bit by hand. You don't have to do this, but if you have been watching the videos on this channel, you know this is my favorite part of making bread. If you're not going to do all the labor by hand, you might as well add some of the labor when you're going to knead the dough. Once it's super nice and taut, you are gonna grease that same standing bowl mixer, or you can choose to grease a different bowl, but add some of that grease spray and allow your dough to rise for about an hour. This is not going to be a super large rise. This is actually just to allow the instant yeast to ferment the dough, because we want to be able to use it and have it be nice and pliable. Once you've let your dough rise, we're going to take it out. Super nice and gorgeous. It should be a little fluffy, but not too much. And then we're going to take a rolling pin, add some flour to that rolling pin, and roll the dough to more or less a square where you can fit your butter insert. So it doesn't have to be perfect. I've seen people use the square method, a different type of enclosure. This is actually the method that has worked the best for me, and I've tried many times to make vegan croissants, and often the butter would just kind of slip out and it would not turn out super delicious. So I recommend rolling out your dough to a rectangle and then including your butter insert. So take that bad boy out of the refrigerator or the freezer, take the parchment paper off and insert it and totally enclose the dough. So grab the edges of your dough and cover your butter insert as well as possible, making sure that none of it sticks out. So especially at the ends of your dough, make sure that the dough is covering it nicely, pat it down, make sure that there's no air coming out, because this will only make the butter stay within the dough. You don't want it to come out while you're actually taking the rolling pin to the dough and adding those layers to the dough. Once you've done this, we're going to start the layering process, which is actually not as intense as most people think it's going to be. The most important part, though, is to keep that vegan butter inside of our dough, because if it's out and it's coming out, we've chosen an incorrect butter or we've done something incorrectly, and when you go to actually bake your croissants, there will be no butter left and it'll all fall out and you won't have those wonderful layers. So once you've inserted your butter, make sure that you are going to roll out your dough to be a long and thin rectangle, making sure that it's long coming towards you. So you don't want it to be super wide. And I like to do this, the best way to sort of explain it is you have that rectangle, right? You want to lay it vertically and then you want to roll it up and down to create a really long rectangle that is not super wide in width. This makes it super easy to apply the book turn, which I will show you in 1 second. So once everything is super well combined, it's nice and thin, that butter's staying inside, take the top half, go to the middle, fold it into the middle of your dough, and do the same with your bottom half, folding it up towards the middle of your dough, and then folding it once more upon each other so it looks like a book. So I'm going to do this twice, so you're going to see it again in just a moment, but it creates this beautiful layering within the dough that is iconic of the croissants. You need to perfect this because this is what makes the viennoiserie pastry. So we're going to apply the book fold one more time before we're done with this dough, and we're going to let it ferment overnight. So do the same exact process. Flip it so it's vertical facing you, take that rolling pin, add some flour, and roll as thinly as possible but also as long as possible, making sure not to make it super wide. That's not very important because that's gonna make the book fold more challenging. So just a little bit of width, but make sure to focus on that length. This time around, the bread will be a little bit more taut and more difficult to roll out because it has been forming that gluten. So be gentle with it, don't over roll, let it sort of speak to you, and once it starts to pull back and it's too challenging, maybe give it a little bit of a rest, 10 to 15 minutes, and get back to it. So we're going to apply that book fold once more, take that top half, go to the middle, take that bottom half and meet it in the middle, not overlapping, and then fold it upon each other to create that wonderful book look. And then after that step, you pretty much are done. So I've just taught you how to make an excellent book turn. So if you just need that information, I'll leave a little chapter in the video for you all to check out. So you can watch this video and go directly to that time and learn that specific roll. But once you finish your book turn, we're gonna put our dough into a plastic bag of your choice and then put it overnight in the fridge to rest. Now, day 2, this is when you've finished proving your dough in the refrigerator. It's nice and plump, but it's not super fermented. We're gonna start making these croissants. So, you're gonna take your rolling pin, make sure to flour it once more, and then lay and roll out your dough to a 13-inch by 11-inch rectangle. So 13 inches in your horizontal dimension and 11 inches in your vertical dimension, your width and your height. So, once you're done with that, make sure it's as even as possible. Some pastry makers cut the edges off. They want that perfect sort of square edge. I'm actually all about sustainability and functionality, so I try to use as much of the dough as possible and not have any scraps, because more often than not, I will actually just leave those scraps to die, or I'll throw them out, or they'll freeze in the refrigerator or in the freezer and I'll never touch them again. So I try to use as much of the dough as possible, even if this is antithetical to the process. This is what I like to do because I don't like to waste anything. So I have my rough rectangle, 13 by 11 inches, and then you're gonna take, for this part you do need a ruler. You're gonna make little slits every 3 inches. So for your bottom half, start from 0 and go to 1, 2, 3, perfect 3 inches slit, 1, 2, 3, perfect slit, 1, 2, 3, perfect slit. But when you're gonna do the top half, actually start a 1/2 inch in. So start at the 1/2 inch and then go 3 inches from there. So you're gonna meet every half, of course 3 inches in, and slide it there. Slide your rolling pin there, or your knife, or whatever you're using to cut, because you're gonna cut triangles out of this dough, which will create the shape of the croissant when you roll it up. So be sure to do this. This is actually super important, and this is what creates the layout and the format for your croissant dough. Once you've applied your slits, the rest is pretty easy. You're gonna take a straight knife or a pizza roller. I recommend using a straight knife if you don't trust your own hand. If you're not confident in cutting a perfectly straight line, take a knife. A knife works very, very well. I should have done it myself because it perhaps would have been a bit easier. But take that knife and then follow the mark of the top, so that 1/2 inch mark, to the bottom. And then once more to the top, to the bottom, to the top, to the bottom, to the top, to the bottom, creating those excellent triangles that are gonna be what we roll and create our croissants with. So after that, you can either discard or use the 2 left and right edge pieces of the dough. I love to use them, and I sort of make random shapes at my pleasure and try to roll croissants if I can. You'll see one of the croissants that I made from the edge actually turned out kind of impromptu. It was a bit of an experiment, but it was still delicious, and you still get pastry. So I recommend not throwing these edges out, even if they're not perfect triangles, just because you'll have extra crispy croissant bread that you can put some jam on there. It's almost like a wonderful little treat, even if it's not a perfect croissant. So to the perfect triangles though, the way that you roll a croissant is you take the wide edge, so the side that's longer, and then you essentially roll it in towards the thinnest end possible, making sure that you apply pressure in the middle of the croissant to have that croissant stick, so the dough will stick to one another. And you'll sort of get this shape quite naturally. So start at the wider end, and then with both hands, sort of, or just one hand, up to your choosing, roll towards the thinnest part of the croissant. And then when you lie the croissants flat, make sure that the thinnest side, the small side, is tucked underneath, because if you allow this to be at the top or something, they tend to unravel. So make sure that you sit your croissants on that very thin little bottom piece. Do this to all of your croissants and all of your wonderful pastry dough that's remaining. Create a shape at your own will. And then we have to allow the croissants to prove. So this is a lot of proving, but it's totally worth it, so we get those layers. You're gonna put some parchment paper on some baking trays and allow your croissants to prove for about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Some people cover their croissants while they're proving. I just sort of put a little bit of soy milk and olive oil, like you'll see in a second, as you've seen in my previous videos, on my bake so they don't dry out. So once you've set your croissants on there, take a brush or your hands, whatever you have available, mix some soy milk and olive oil and apply those to the top of the croissants. It works as an egg wash, it's sustainable, it does the same thing, it creates that nice brown look. Make sure to do it. And now it's the easy part. You allow it to prove for those 2 hours until they're doubled in size, and you have that gorgeous, look at those layers, they look great. Layers in the croissant, it's nice and fluffy. And then we're gonna bake it in the oven at 375. For about 25 to 30 minutes. And make sure before you preheat your oven, and you can also move it while your oven is hot, you take one of those baking levels and you move it to the top half of your oven and the other one to the bottom half of your oven. Bake for those 25 to 30 minutes at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. And then halfway through, make sure to take your trays out with the croissants. Flip them from front to back and also switch the trays from top to bottom. This will create a perfectly even bake in your home oven without having to worry about steam and all of these sort of oven hacks, etc. This is what I find works best for the home baker. So when you've allowed them to brown, and you can keep them in longer. Some people really like their croissants to be really deep brown, almost like a little charred at the edges. I like mine at this sort of level. You have perfect croissants that you can enjoy throughout the week. You can make some croissant sandwiches. You can enjoy with butter and jam. And there you have it, guys. We've made some excellent vegan croissants. I hope you've enjoyed this excellent recipe and full vegan tutorial. Please let me know if you try this out. Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for daily shorts and also every Friday a full vegan tutorial. See you next week.